Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity, or AVA, webinar series, what we're now calling Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yersich. I work with AVA in a few different capacities, including as an early career researcher, and also lead on the webinar series, which you're joining us for today. Outside of that, I am the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children at Simon Fraser University. To begin, on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which we live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in culture, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. Just a few procedural things before we begin. A gentle reminder that this session is being recorded. So please keep your cameras off, your microphones muted, and if you don't want your name to show on the recording, this is a good time to change your name to participant. As the host, I'll be here monitoring the chat, so if any issues arise for you during the webinar, please feel free to message in the chat and I will assist you. You are also welcome to use the chat to pose questions to our speaker, and we will save time at the end of the webinar today for the Q&A portion, and our speaker will get to your questions at that point. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bonnie Kaplan. Dr. Kaplan is currently a professor emerita in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. Originally from Ohio, Dr. Kaplan did all of her training in the US. She has published widely on the biological basis of developmental disorders and mental health, particularly the contribution of nutrition to brain development and brain function. Welcome, Bonnie. It's great to have you here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me there. This is really quite delightful. As I watch the names of the people joining us, I see a lot of old friends. And I feel I should add, because that bio was written before the current tariff problems and the antagonism at the border, that I feel the need to say this, I've been in Canada more than half my life. So yeah, Ohio is a distant past. Somehow my computer thinks I'm speaking French. Pardon me while, I don't know if you can see this. Okay, I didn't think I was. Okay, save. So, can we share the screen now, Sarah?
Yep, we can see your screen perfectly.
Oh, you can, okay.
Yep.
All right, so the only important thing about my title page is that I've highlighted my website, because I can't possibly cover all the material that I'd like to cover. And so I've really used my website a lot to post talks and information and so forth. You might want to jot it down, and you won't find it unless you know that my middle initial is J. It's conventional to have a disclosure slide, as you know, and I just want to point out that I have no commercial interest in the sale of any product or in any company, and I will be mentioning a couple of them, so it's important for you to know that. But I do have a sort of commercial interest in the book that I co-authored with my former student, Julia Ruckledge, who's now in New Zealand. Except that if the book's selling very well, but any significant money from it goes into the two charitable funds that I manage, one in the US and one in Canada, to support further research in nutrition and mental health. Okay, there we go. I also like to point this out. I am only going to talk about one important driver of mental health problems. And there are so many. And I know that in this audience, especially, you're looking at a lot of psychosocial issues and community and ACEs and all of those kinds of things. But it is the most overlooked driver of the mental health care crisis. And we'll be talking about why that might be as I go along. But hidden brain hunger is very, very important. Why do I think that there is hidden brain hunger? Well, let's look at what people are eating now. There is research from both Canada and the United States in the recent years asking this question, answering this question, asking and answering this question. What percentage of caloric intake comes from industrialized, ultra-processed, they call it ultra-processed food. I don't use the word food for it. I call it packages of chemicals, sugar, and salt. The point is, what percentage of our society's food intake is now coming from items which are nutrient-free? This is for Canada. It's the most recent one and it groups all the ages together, and it's roughly half, which is shocking. That's in comparison to the way our parents and grandparents ate, which was very different before we had these kinds of foods. In the US, we have data from NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which has been going on since 1971. You have to wonder if it will survive the current cutbacks, but they do a very thorough job of evaluating a stratified sample across the US, and they do it more by age more consistently. So 2/3 of the caloric intake of our children, age 2 to 19, comes from the ultra-processed rubbish, and more than half for adults. I mean, I look at that, and the important figure on this slide is 67%. The references are from 2021 and 2022, and so they're very recent. So that's saying that our children, what are we doing to our children? Our children are voluntarily cutting out 2/3 of the nutrients that previous generations consumed, or we parents are not feeding our kids the nutrients that they really need compared to previous generations. And I think that should make us all wonder what happens to people whose nutrient intake is half or less of what it could or should be. We don't have perfect data to answer that question because it would call up the need to do the kinds of studies that would be very hard to get past ethics, where you would be starving people, basically. But there is one study, so we don't have to guess, and we can look at that and get at least some information on the topic. After World War II at the University of Minnesota, they ran experiments that are often called the starvation experiments. And mostly they were to look at digestion. As you may know, when people survived the camps and were released from the camps, many of them died after being refed because nobody knew how to deal with such severely malnourished people. So they were mostly looking at the gastrointestinal system. But one study looked at mental health. It's the only one that I know of. They took 36 normal, healthy men. They were, I think, conscientious objectors to World War II, and recruited them to come live on campus where all of their food intake would be controlled. And they gave them half of the normal caloric or nutrient intake for 6 months. Now, there are limitations here. It was men only. It was both half of caloric and half of nutrient intake. Our kids are getting plenty of calories. They're not, getting the nutrients though. And of course, our experiment that we're doing is for more than 6 months. But what they found is basically what you see here in 1950s language. You see all of the characteristics of depression, anxiety, and even perhaps ADD, anyhow, inability to concentrate. But here's the shocking thing. It was in all 36 men. So right now, the World Health Organization says that we are currently at a 50% lifetime prevalence, okay? That's not point prevalence, but lifetime. So that says half of us will have a diagnosed mental health problem at some point in our lifetime. And if you're not shocked at that, you're not remembering what it used to be like 50 years ago when it was more like 3%. But that is shocking, 50%. But it's not 100% yet. So many of us would like to see it go down and not up, but that's frightening to think that it could go up even further. Now, this is an overview of what I want to talk to you about. I've put it into 4 topics, and I want to just go through them, step through them one by one. It's what I talked about in the outline description for this talk. And the first one is addressing something that I think we all know, but maybe haven't seen it spelled out. So where do nutrients come from? They come from the soil. I mean, the soil is the foundation for human health. and animal health. All of life on Earth is dependent on this tiny little strip of topsoil that's only a few centimeters thick and that wraps all the way around the globe, except in the oceans, of course, and except when it has been swept away or abused in some way. But if it is very healthy, that little strip of topsoil feeds plants. So this is a plant growing in what we hope is very healthy soil. And if the soil is very healthy, that plant will absorb approximately 15 minerals. And I've spoken at quite a few agricultural conferences in the last 5 years around the world, actually. And I keep asking people, have I missed anything? What do you think of that number? And they all agree it's approximately 15, depending on whether you include carbon, which is ubiquitous, and blah, blah, blah. 15 is the right number. And then those clever little plants who can do things that we cannot do. We don't know how to run our own photosynthesis. We don't know how to convert things within us, but we can't control it. But plants can. And they can synthesize approximately 15 vitamins. Again, we cannot do that. Humans can only synthesize a very small amount, usually a bit of B vitamins in our gut. But by and large, plants are much smarter than we are at dealing with this. So then we come along, we eat the produce from that plant, and we should get, if it was a healthy plant, we should get approximately 30 minerals and vitamins. Or we eat the animals that came along and ate the plants and the produce, and we get those nutrients from the animals. Those are the two main pathways. So what's happening with our food that we're depending on? If you look at whole foods, now the RDA is a very weak measure of what we should consume. It's based on what armies needed for World War II to keep soldiers marching. Has nothing to do with brain function, okay? But it's all that we have to use. So recommended daily allowance is what we use. And whole foods, if you look at all of the minerals here and the vitamins that are down here, depending on what you're looking at, Brazil nuts, bananas, kale, eggs, lentils, kiwi fruit, etc. This is the kind of distribution you get. But I guess I hit that too quickly. For ultra processed rubbish, again, I just can't call it food. The reason I can't call it food is that food, open any dictionary, food is defined as what we consume to build our cells and sustain and maintain our cells, okay? The stuff that we are consuming in ultra processed rubbish doesn't do that, simply doesn't do that. So unless you get a few nutrients, and this is about what you get, okay? Calcium down to vitamin C, and this is from crackers, soft drinks, French fries, margarine, etc. Okay, so take a look at those two graphs and you can see why people who are eating ultra processed stuff a lot, as our children especially are simply depriving themselves of these. We use the term micronutrients often to refer to minerals and vitamins together. So I hope I can use that term with you folks. Dietitians aren't totally, comfortable with it, and I understand why, but it's a useful term to communicate. So they aren't getting as many micronutrients from what they're eating. So that's where we should be getting our nutrients. What do nutrients then do in our brains? And in my opinion, this is the most important thing that any of you clinicians out there can be teaching your clients, patients, etc. So let's talk about this. When I was growing up, and I know it's not much change now because I've asked some young people in the family, I was taught we had to eat a healthy diet to grow strong bones and muscles. And I have nothing against strong bones and muscles. But I was never taught, and they're not being taught, that mostly we're eating for our brains. And I'm going to prove that to you. Our brain is the greediest organ that we have. It's only about 2% of our body weight. But even when you're sitting at rest, not doing anything, it represents at least 20% of the metabolic demands. Another way to look at it, oh, and by the way, since you're listening to me, I'm sure it's much busier. Okay, you're not at 20%. You're up at 50%, I'm sure of it. Now, each of us has 4 to 6 liters of blood inside us. And it's an indication of how important it is to feed our brains that like 15 to 25% of that blood is in our brain every minute that our heart is beating. And of course, it's doing other things. It's carrying oxygen. It's taking away waste products, but especially it's carrying all the micronutrients that you've been consuming in the last few hours. And I'm sure you've been consuming a lot, right? So it's very busy. And I always put this slide up because people don't realize how unbelievably intricate the vasculature is in our brains, but that's indicative of what's going on. Why do we need all of that? It all boils down to metabolism, which is just a fancy word for the transformation of one compound to another compound. And I'm going to show you what micronutrients do. Suppose you have chemical A and it has to be converted to chemical B. Okay, we're not going to use a bunch of technical terms here. It's an enzymatic reaction. Virtually all of the metabolic reactions that involve transformation of compounds in our brains and bodies are enzymatic. What do enzymes need to do their work, though? They need minerals and vitamins, and they're called cofactors because enzymes have to be able to grab minerals and vitamins. They have to be sticky enough to grab the minerals and vitamins that you have been smart enough to consume that are now coursing through the blood, going through your brain, and then the enzyme can do its work and chemical A is converted to chemical B. Now, some of you have more of a biological background and you've seen graphs like this. I'm obviously not going to talk about this, but it just shows you how very complicated brain metabolism is. And you might recognize a few of the reaction items in there. I'm going to show you something simpler. And if any of you, since some of you know me and have known me for a long time, if any of you have heard me give a lecture in the last, I'd say 20 years, you have seen this slide because I put it together to try to show people why we have to consume our cofactors all the time. And I picked tryptophan metabolism, just a tiny little corner of it. And I put tryptophan, serotonin, and melatonin in red because when I built this slide, I was in fact about to speak to a lay audience, and I figured that most people would know what those words were. And I could say, as I'm saying to you, ignore all the other words that are long chemical words. You don't need to know them. But what you need to know is that the arrows are enzymatic reactions. And I didn't put the names of the enzymes in there either because they get too complicated. But you can go online and do this for yourself. And you can find out that to get from this step to that step, you need trace amounts of 3 minerals. To get to this step, you need vitamin B6. Here you need 2 B vitamins and iron. Here you need B6 again. The B vitamins are very important for brain function. 2 B vitamins and molybdenum. Have you had your molybdenum today? It's a trace mineral, and if you're eating enough veggies, you're probably getting enough. Zinc, and so on it goes. And there are, I think, around 20 different micronutrients required in this pathway. And you might recognize this large group going into acetyl coenzyme A that goes into ATP production in our mitochondria. So it's really important. All of these micronutrients have to be in abundant supply going through your bloodstream all the time. I think we're raising a generation of children who think that they can live on air, and they don't know this. And I think they could be taught this. I know this. I've taught it down to grade 6. This is not unique to tryptophan. It's true of, or serotonin. It's true of every other neurotransmitter. I have slides on several of them. Every metabolic step that requires an enzymatic reaction. And I want to point out that even though I'm focusing a lot on the minerals and vitamins, it's very relevant for the omega-3s because alpha linolenic acid has to be converted by enzymes to reach the point of EPA and then DHA, which you probably all recognize, and every one of those enzymes needs cofactors. And then in the mitochondria, I'm just going to dwell on this for a moment because it's very relevant to the microbiome, the gut microbiome, okay? ATP is produced by mitochondria, and we have mitochondria in virtually all of our cells. There are some very interesting exceptions like red blood cells, but otherwise as many as 10,000 in some of our cells. And their production of ATP is what enables us to self-regulate the amount of inflammation in our gut and everywhere else. So very relevant to health in every way. And you know them as our energy factories. I have a few other points in here because I've just been reading up on the things that mitochondria do. And I was fascinated to find out that there are these little machines that turn at 200 revolutions a second. And with every rotation, they produce 3 ATP molecules. There's a lot more known than when I was in school. But it all begins with having abundant micronutrients to feed the mitochondria. Don't you think we could teach cofactors in schools? Just that word, cofactors, would go a long way to explaining why we have to pay attention to what we consume. And mental health clinics too. Oh, I think I'm going to skip over. Well, no, I won't. All right. Some of you who know about mitochondria know about the electron transport chain and the 5 steps, which are the final production of ATP. And this is just an interesting slide to show the basics of that. And it requires, including all the different B vitamins, just that step in mitochondria requires 17 different micronutrients. So there you go. Okay. But what do I want you to take away from this? This is the most important message. I am still asked by friends, good friends, who say, Bonnie, what's the most important vitamin? They never say minerals. Vitamin I should take to be able to make my brain work well. Well, it's the wrong question. One of the things that these pathways tell us is that we should ignore single nutrient thinking. In fact, Julie Ruckledge and I wrote a paper a while back on magic bullet thinking, and we have to stop thinking that way. But our funding agencies still do. They don't like to fund broad spectrum nutrient treatments, even though we know that it's a broad spectrum of at least 30 vitamins and minerals that are needed for optimal functioning. Why can't we think about treatment in terms of what our brains need? That's a revolution that I have yet to see happen. So what do we need? Around 15 vitamins, 15 minerals, the essential fatty acids, amino acids, and a few thousand phytonutrients, most of which haven't even been named or their function hasn't been defined. Things like lycopene, etc. And there are thousands of them, which we only get because they're packaged with the minerals and vitamins in healthy food. So that's why, even though some of us have studied only micronutrients in pill form, we actually absolutely are good food, or I should say food first people. And I've told you about some of the functions: neurotransmitter synthesis and breakdown, mitochondrial production of ATP. So to examine the evidence base, there is no point in looking at 100 years of single nutrient treatment studies because they're just not asking the question right. And they sometimes get interesting little small effects. And then a nutrient comes along like vitamin D, and it becomes so trendy that granting agencies throw money at studies that are going to study omega-3s or vitamin D, or, I don't know what the flavor of the nutrient of the year will be next year. But we need to really only devote our attention to what our brains need. And that means looking at what a term that some of us who've done these studies use, a BSM, a broad spectrum micronutrient formula. So it's time to start talking about the evidence base and the relevance specifically for mental health. I stress that this is a brief overview because there have been approximately 100 peer-reviewed studies in the last 25 years. And if you know anybody who can compress 100 studies into an hour-long talk. I'd like to know how they do it. The most interesting thing about those 100 peer-reviewed studies is that, to the best of my knowledge, there has been only one ever covered in the international media. That has huge implications for why you don't know that there have been 100, okay? Because most people say, oh, there's no evidence that nutrition affects mental health. I mean, it seems logical. Nutrition's the foundation of our health, but there just isn't any good evidence. Well, that's not true. What that statement actually means is I have not looked at the evidence. So kudos to all of you who have come to listen to me today, because I'm going to help you look at some of the evidence. Now, I usually break it into oh, by the way, when a physician says that to me, as many have, I have to remember to think kindly. I have lived to see continuing medical education transferred from academic institutions to pharmaceutical companies. I remember when it was different. And so how would they know? I mean, how would they ever know about nutrient treatment of mental health? Because the pharmaceutical companies very much don't want that information out there, so they're not going to be passing it along. So we're all the products of our education. So back to the sentence I started. I usually break the research down into 4 categories, and I'm not going to show you examples of the first 2 because you can't prove causation from them. But I just want to mention there are about 25 international correlational studies. They all pretty much show the same thing. People who eat real food, whole food, Mediterranean style whole food diets with lots of fruits and vegetables and very few ultra processed rubbishy things have fewer symptoms of depression and anxiety. And these studies come from Japan and China and New Zealand and Finland and the UK and a little from the US, Canada, you name it. Oh, Brazil, all kinds of countries, all kinds of cultures. They all find the same thing. If you want to look for people who have fewer mental health problems with depression and anxiety, look for people who are eating more of a whole foods diet. But it doesn't prove causation, right? The arrow could go both ways. And then a second type, which is interesting, but it's a little bit problematic for reasons I don't have time to go into. There are 4 studies that took people, adults in all of them, people with depression, and taught them how to change their diets, and showed that all of them had some symptom amelioration, in some cases symptom remission, and they also saved money. And we're going to talk about that, I hope, today. But the other 2 categories of studies really prove causation, and that's very important. Some are prospective longitudinal studies where you recruit people who have not yet been diagnosed with any mental health problem, and you try to determine whether or not their dietary pattern predicts their vulnerability to a mental health problem. And the other large group of studies, which I've been involved, I have to use the past tense, it's been 8 years, okay, I was involved with before I retired. There are more than 55 studies of BSM, broad spectrum micronutrient formulas, showing mental health improvements, and mainly in fully blinded randomized controlled trials. And by the way, some of them also looking at the amount of money saved. So I'm just going to show you one example of a prospective longitudinal study. I picked one that was done in Canada, and it's the one, what are we doing to our children? This is the youngest age group that has been studied with this method. And this was done by Kara Lowen, and she was studying under Dr. Paul Voiglers at the University of Alberta. They had over 3,000 children in Nova Scotia, age 10 to 11, and they were evaluated for 9 different patterns of behavior. Dietary intake constituted 6 of them, and the other 3 reflected screen time and physical activity. So it was more than a dietary study, it was lifestyle. And that's great because they all kind of go together. And it was published in Pediatrics, which is the leading journal of the American Pediatric Society. So, it was scrutinized heavily. They came back 3 years later and just asked the question, who got referred to a physician because they were having emotional and behavioral problems that had not shown up in 2011, right? We're not there then. Who got referred to a doctor for diagnosis and treatment? And Paul Voigler's put this little cartoon together and said I could use it in teaching about the study because it shows it very clearly that there is no metric on the y-axis. That's why I call it a cartoon. So what they did was, based on the data they collected in 2011, they put the children who met only 1, 2, or 3 of the guidelines for those lifestyle issues, like low screen time, more physical activity, better eating pattern. They arbitrarily set them at 100%. And then they asked the question, the kids who met the guidelines for 4, 5, or 6 of those guidelines, were they referred as often as this group for treatment of a mental health problem? And the answer was no. They had protection of or reduced risk. And it was a 39% reduction, which is quite amazing. And then they had a group of kids who did meet 7, 8, or 9 of those guidelines. And those children had a 56% reduction in referral for diagnosis or treatment of a mental or behavioral problem. So that's impressive. And then they did an analysis of, basically predicting how much a single guideline was worth, if you want to put it that way. And every additional recommendation met was associated with 15% fewer physician visits for mental disorders. So think about the reduced suffering in families, think about the cost savings for families, and think about the cost savings for our healthcare system. And we have others. I mean, I'd love to give you a talk sometime just on the data we've put together on cost savings. But I have to move on. So I want to tell you about the broad spectrum micronutrient formulas. And this is where, as I said in my disclosure slide, I have to say something about companies. There are 2 of these broad spectrum formulas. The reason there are 2 is that the first company, which is called True Hope, which was developed in and is in Alberta, developed Empower Plus. And then the 2 families who established True Hope split up after working together for about 15 years. We don't call it a divorce in business, but it's kind of equivalent. And the Hardy family split off from the Stephan family. The Hardy family started their own company and they called it Hardy Nutritionals. But they both make broad spectrum formulas, daily essential nutrients. And those of us who've been doing the studies on these formulas continue to study both of them and we get, the same results. They're slightly different, but not to any great extent. Both formulas have approximately 30 minerals and vitamins, selected amino acids, and antioxidants. And this is the most important thing. And again, I'm going to throw age at you because when I was in school, I distinctly remember no physician or scientist worth their salt would take money from a drug company to do a study. It was considered to be absolutely unethical. And it all changed. And if you want to read about it, Marcia Angel has written a brilliant book about why it changed to the exact opposite now. All of our mental health research on any drugs, it's all carried out by drug companies. Well, partly because I'm old enough to remember what I consider to be a better system, less corrupt, really. I asked if the researchers who were studying these 2 formulas, because I was the first one, I had a little bit of influence, and could we set it up so that we all remained completely independent? And so these companies have never funded a study. They've never promoted, they've never interfered with the study. They simply are apart. And as I always say, we don't tell them how to run their business and they don't tell us how to run the research. They do provide free supplements as well as placebos, because who else could do the placebo and the product, right? For any university ethics approved protocol. And that's the extent of their involvement. So their formulas taken together now have more data on them than any formula anywhere in the world. Here they are right in Alberta, and most of you Albertans probably don't know about them, which is the way it is. Anyway, Julia Ruckledge, who I've mentioned twice already, and my co-author, she and I made sure that we really covered the literature in our book. So chapter 11 reviews it all. And she's also brilliant at making these summary slides. I'm going to be showing you a few of her slides now as summaries. She's tried to keep up with all the studies on broad spectrum Alberta formulas and based on diagnosis. You know, if you're going to study a mental disorder, you have to use the DSM, right? But the thing that we have all shown, and this is researchers in Canada, the US, and New Zealand, is no matter what diagnostic category we pick, autism, mood, whatever, the common theme, what we all see in all of our outcome measures, is that there is improved emotion regulation, especially decreases in meltdowns, violent outbursts, irritability, etc. Irritability is a very typical one because it's a transdiagnostic symptom, and it doesn't matter what diagnostic background it's with. That is what improves most quickly and most thoroughly. Now, this is a slide of 3 RCTs, all placebo-controlled, all randomized, done in children. First adults is the first one, and then 2 in children with ADHD and mood dysregulation. There is now a 4th one on the mood dysregulation, but it's still under review, so I don't have it in the slide. These first 2 were done in New Zealand, and this one was a multi-center, multi-country study run by Dr. Jenny Johnstone at Oregon Health and Science University, and it was carried out at Oregon Health and Science University, also at Ohio State University, and also University of Lethbridge, where the PI is Dr. Brenda Leon, who some of you may remember. So what this, and by the way, they're all published in major journals: British Journal of Psychiatry, JCPP, JCAP, which is the Journal of the American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So this excellent literature. And the reason you can put them on one slide is because all of them, as a clinician measure, use the CGI-I, the Clinical Global Impressions for improvement. And this shows you exactly what happened. The micronutrients showed, when they broke the blind at the end, consistently showed a much greater response rate than the placebo. We always get big placebo responses because when you give people a whole lot of capsules to take, they think, oh, wow, this has to be powerful, right? Or something in their brain reacts that way. So this is especially true for the mood dysregulation characteristics. But I just want to point out that, you know, I've always want to mention again and again that the world doesn't know about this literature, and they should, but it's because even, you know, I get canceled, others get canceled, they get scheduled for talks or interviews. And fortunately, most of the time we can give them, but sometimes we get canceled, or sometimes something is pulled from a newspaper that was planned to be published because I guess they get their funding from pharma. I don't know why, but they don't like the fact that we study something that, you know, ooh, vitamins and minerals could be dangerous, right? The fact that the human race's existence depends upon vitamins and minerals somehow doesn't get through. But it's good to know that there are, and we didn't know about it till they publish it, there are groups out there monitoring the literature. So the World Federation of Societies of Biological Psychiatry, as well as CanMat, which some of you are probably familiar with, looked at the data on the Hardy Nutritional form of DEN, as they call it, and for ADHD, they call it nutraceuticals, which is a stupid word in my opinion. And they gave it an evidence grade of A, given the 2 RCTs which were published at that time. Now, the Maddie trial, which is the last one from Jenny Johnstone and Brenda Leung and the people at Ohio State, was published 3 months after they presented this. I think it would be a clear evidence of level A once they look at that one, but it was bad timing. Anyway, I'm going to offer you an opinion. I don't do this at every talk, but I want to make a bold evidence-based statement that you should consider if any of you are clinicians. With 3 placebo-controlled RCTs on ADHD, plus dozens more in other mood-related problems, plus case series within subject crossover reports, all peer-reviewed, replicated in 3 countries, all obtaining the same results. I think no child should be treated first with medication when presenting with meltdowns, ADHD, emotional dysregulation. I think it's really almost immoral. I think first we should teach people to to feed their brains, teach them lifestyle things, teach them coping skills, parenting courses, all the things that some of you folks in the audience, I'm sure, are very devoted to. They're very important. I think of nutrition as the foundation, but it's not the only variable that's important for these families to be exposed to. If needed, if changing diet and all these other things is not sufficient, then add a broad spectrum formula of minerals and vitamins. You're, standing on a very solid evidence base for it. And still, if medication is considered on top of that, then I would say treat it like a supplement. That's why I try not to use the word supplement for vitamins and minerals. They're not supplementary, they're foundational. Medication should be a supplement. And thank goodness we have medication when it's needed, but it shouldn't be first line of treatment. If anyone finds that outrageous, be sure to let me know later. Now I want to move to resilience. Given what AVA does, and I'm just still learning more about it, I thought you should take a look at this because you're dealing with people who've gone through terrible crises and who are post-traumatic, whatever, and they often need to improve their resilience. Julia Ruckledge and I never planned to get into the resilience field. But what happened was she was in the middle of doing clinical trials of one of the Alberta formulas in Christchurch. She's at University of Canterbury there, if I might have said that already. And when the first earthquake struck in 2010, September 2010, and some of you might remember it, it was really massive. And then they had 8,000 aftershocks over the course of 5 months. And then they had a massive earthquake in February in 2011, and a third of their downtown was destroyed and a few hundred people died. So it was a population under great stress. Well, what do you do when you're handed lemons? You try to make lemonade, right? Trite though it is, Julia decided to study the impact of earthquakes on the people who'd been in her clinical trials who were taking the micronutrients, one of the Alberta formulas, at the time, and people who weren't. And then she did a randomized controlled trial. So she has several studies on the impact of micronutrients in helping with resilience in this population. And I'm going to show you the RCT data. But then, before I go ahead with the graph, what happened in Alberta? We had the flood of 2013. Julia, who had lived here as a student at University of Calgary, her husband is from Alberta. She's from Ontario originally. But they knew what was going on, and they called me and said, go to Mayor Nenshi and tell him that he needs to recommend people get on at least B complex, and I'm going to be telling you about that in a moment, and do a study, do something for these people. Julia's in-laws were severely impacted by that flood. So it was very personal, but we both knew that there was no way I would be able to get through to the mayor's office. So we did a study, and I'm going to show you the flood results. And some of you may remember that trial. And then a few years ago, you might remember a crazy person went into 2 mosques in Christchurch and this very peaceful town and killed a lot of people. And the people who survived were severely traumatized. And you can't ever do a placebo-controlled trial after a huge trauma, but you can do comparators, which we did. But after the massacres, they couldn't even do that. They didn't have the ability or the time to go through ethics, so they did clinical monitoring. And in all cases, we have data from the same measure, which is the DAS, okay, depression, anxiety, and stress scale. So we can put them on one slide, as Julia has done. And what we have here is a thick black line to show you what the clinical cutoff is. You want to get everybody below that line. And we have an endpoint for all of them to compare to baseline, and the endpoint is 4 to 6 weeks. So this is what happened in the earthquake to the people who took micronutrients. 4 to 6 weeks, and their stress levels were down in the normal range. And this, surprisingly, we didn't have 8,000 aftershocks after the flood, thank goodness. We just had 1 day of flood, but we had the same effect. The people who got the micronutrients were in the normal range in 4 to 6 weeks. The comparator in the micronutrients, I'm sorry, that's the massacre line. The mass shootings were clinically monitored, and they showed the exact same pattern. And this is the line for the comparator for the earthquakes, which was treatment as usual, which is usually psychiatric medication. And this is the earthquake. Sorry, keep saying the wrong thing. It's not like I haven't shown this slide 50 times. The flood comparator, we had an active comparator. There was some data to suggest that vitamin D at 1,000 IUs might be very useful for improving resilience, but as you can see, it was not as good. And the massacre data had no comparator, of course. So we had very strong data across countries, cultures, different experiences to show improved resilience. And these were people who were taking a broad spectrum formula. So what is the alternative? I have to show you this slide because you're in Alberta. I hardly ever show it, but do you remember the Fort Mac fires in 2016? 80 to 90,000 people were displaced. Well, then I had a lot of data from earthquakes and flood, and I did go to the mayor's office, and they sent me to the emergency response office, and I went there and I had an interview, and they sent me to, they said, pills? You're talking about pills? This has to be medical. You have to go talk to psychiatry. So I called the psychiatrist who was in charge, who I knew well. And because we knew each other well, he was respectful, but he said, Bonnie, this is, you can't even tell people to take nutrients. I can't approve of that. But just to make sure, I'll talk to the dietitians. And the dietitians said, oh, we're writing up a brochure for those 80 to 90,000 people. We'll just tell them to try to eat well. Well, how do you eat well when you're living in a dorm somewhere, say at University of Calgary? You don't have a stove to cook on. And that's all they got. And I was not allowed to educate people even about the vitamin B data that I'm going to show you in a minute. But I want to show you what happened according to our province's own data. They put this up on their website, and I just happened to get an alert. This was where the fire happened in June of 2016. These two curves are mood and anxiety disorders. And as you can see, they did not go into the normal range in 4 to 6 weeks. They went up, up, up. And they were treated, treatment as usual, which is referral to psychiatry and medication usually. So that's discouraging. Now, why do I keep mentioning B vitamins? We've always known that there is this, especially European data, showing how important B vitamins are. Well, for example, I don't have time to talk about the dementia research, but some of you might know the VitaCog trial from Oxford, University of Oxford, which showed just taking B complex for high dose B complex for 2 years slowed cognitive decline and slowed brain atrophy on MRIs. So we know that it's very important for sustaining brain health. But also there are all these other people who've been doing B vitamin, typically B complex research in university students who are going through exams, in people who have just been laid off from work, et cetera, the normal unpleasant things that happen to us in life. And sometimes, remember, they're not clinically anxious or clinically depressed, but sometimes these studies have shown that B vitamins are efficacious in reducing stress, in building resilience. And I know I recommend it. I recommend to friends who have been widowed to, start taking one B complex after breakfast every day. Can't hurt. if you have too much B vitamins, you just pee it out. And a lot of people find it's very good for resilience. And then in 2019, a group did the first meta-analysis I had seen. And as you can see in the forest plot, there was some evidence of favoring treatment, even though these are not clinically ill people, right? So it's a good thing to know about for resilience. Now, I want to end on something that I don't know if you'd say it's resilience or what, but it's the latest study or series of studies out of the New Zealand group. And it's so important. And I know we have some apron people here, and you know that this is the kind of thing that I really wanted to do way back in 2008. And Brenda Leon was around then too. But we knew that Health Canada would never approve giving pregnant women minerals and vitamins because, oh, could be dangerous, right? I don't know if they've changed, but it's good that this study that I'm going to show you, or this series of studies, has been done outside of Canada. So this is the Nutrimum trial. Several papers have been published, and I always give you the year and the journal name if possible, so you can look them up. And by the way, I'll make my slides available to anybody, but I'll just show you some of the salient findings. To understand it, you just have to know it was fully blinded, randomized, controlled trial in pregnant women for 12 weeks. Their placebo was a little unusual. Apparently, the soil in New Zealand is very iodine efficient, and so every pregnant woman gets iodine. And so their placebo was the usual placebo plus iodine, which the company made up to their government's requirements. So inclusion criteria, you'll recognize that. I'm going to skip over this stuff so we can look at results. It was a very thorough study. This is not the first study that looked at biomarkers, but I'll mention some of the gut microbiome data that she and Jenny Johnstone have been collecting. And now they have data up to the age of 1 year, and they expect to go till the children are 5 years old. So this is the design, and there's something very, very clever about it. You probably wouldn't know this, or well, maybe some of you would. There's, to the best of our knowledge, ours, and I don't know who all I mean by our, there has never been a head-to-head comparison of pregnant women with depression and anxiety treated with antidepressants compared to women who were not treated with antidepressants. I guess the feeling is that not treating them would be unethical, which I can fully understand. And so there's never been, and it's just like smoking. I mean, it's amazing to realize there's never been an RCT of smoking in humans. There never will be, because randomizing people to go smoke or not, it just won't happen. So you have to find comparison groups that tell you something, and that's what was done in this study. So in addition to the groups assigned to micronutrients or iodine, or sorry, active placebo with iodine, they had 2 other groups to compare them to. A lot of women who wanted to be in the study were ineligible, many of them because they just didn't have a high enough level of anxiety or depression, and they became here it's called control group, okay? And then 20 women were excluded because they were on antidepressants. You couldn't be on antidepressants to be in one of these 2 groups. So they ended up with an antidepressant comparison group, which had not been done before. I don't know if Apron has looked at anything like this. And they also were monitored every 4 weeks till birth, but they were not given micronutrients. So, and this shows you they're following up to birth and beyond. Here's the main finding, just summarized here: micronutrients versus their active placebo. There was no overall group effect, but very consistently on all of their variables, there were 2 moderators, which were very important for demonstrating who was most likely to benefit from the micronutrients. And they involved history of psychiatric meds, which we think is a stand-in for an indication of the severity. They haven't finished analyzing all this. And the other one's kind of interesting. It was a high score on the SAPIS, which is measuring personality difficulties, which involves emotional dysregulation, and they were more likely to respond well, which seems to fit with the emotional dysregulation piece. But anyway, when you looked at other things like sleep and global functioning, the group who got micronutrients did better. There were some variables that did not improve. Lower homocysteine because of lower inflammation with the micronutrients. And this was interesting, higher B12, D, and C in serum tests, but not as high as they usually get in non-pregnant participants in their clinical trials, which suggests that the mothers are kind of struggling to keep their own nutrient levels high enough while that little fetus is sucking out all the nutrients. And then they have separately published they've published several papers on micronutrients improving diversity in the gut microbiome, and they published this one separately too. The birth outcomes are even more interesting. This is just recently published, and I'm going to show you very quickly. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, but not doing a good job. As you can see, preterm birth was very low in the people who got the micronutrients, much higher in those who were on medication, but not the reference group, the control group. Low birth weight, non-existent in the micronutrient group, very little in the reference group, but higher in the medication group. Infants requiring resuscitation, you can see the pattern of change. Postpartum hemorrhaging, again, micronutrient group doing much better. And neonatal intensive care unit, actually very few referred to the NICU, more from the antidepressant group. So, you know, this is not an anti-medication slide. It's to show people that there is an option, a healthier option. And some women during pregnancy, even though they have mood and anxiety problems, they just don't want to take medication, psychiatric medication. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. It showed basically better orientation, habituation, things that you'd expect in terms of self-regulation, always with the micronutrient group being favored. So this is what I'm going to end on. How do we change human behavior? Okay, I think about this a lot because I'm doing an awful lot of teaching like this, as well as helping to shape curricula in different settings. And I know that this doesn't work. You know it doesn't work. Dietitians have been telling us to eat better since World War II anyway. 70 years has simply not worked. It's getting worse and worse, and you can plot how much it's getting worse by looking at the NHANES data. I think what we have to start doing is teaching why, and that's why I talked to you about cofactor. I think every child in grade 4 should be taught about how we are eating to feed our brains, muscles and bones too, but come on, mostly for our brains. And it's because of the importance of cofactors. It's not a hard concept to learn. Where to begin? Clinically, I think it's important that in every mental health clinic, people be taught about levels of food processing. Teach your patients the difference between whole food, some processing, and the ultra-processed rubbish. And the level 2, and I know if any of you are familiar with it, the NOVA levels are more than 3, but I think for most people, these 3 are enough. Some processing, like freezing a vegetable, is excellent because unless they've been treated very badly, my frozen peas that I pick up at a grocery store were flash frozen and probably have more nutrients protected than the peas that are sitting out in the produce department. But by and large, the produce department should be very important. You've probably all seen the half a plate. I think it's a great visual they're using. Fruits and vegetables should be half of your plate. And you should think about every meal that way. Half your plate, fruits and vegetables. And fruits are not the problem. The problem in North America is we don't eat veggies. So, and potatoes don't count. Okay. And what clinicians can do, I developed this wording because when I was speaking to a group of family doctors, they said they didn't know how to broach the subject to their patients without sounding condescending. So I said, how about this? There's an increasing amount of scientific data showing that what we eat influences how we feel. So let's talk about your diet. And then if you just ask about things like fast food, sodas, fruits and veggies, and don't score them, don't judge them, but just raise the issue. I'm told by clinicians that when you do that, your client will start talking about, oh, I've got to cut back on my sodas or whatever, you know? I think I'm going to skip all this and just end with my two important footnotes. These are the two companies I've talked about. I'm not responsible for how they handle their customers, but I know that they do their best to educate people. And oh, I probably have these in the wrong order. Uh, let's look at number 2 first. The thing is that no one should just buy their products and start them when they're already on psychiatric meds without some education, because everyone who has studied these formulas, as well as several psychiatrists, 3 in particular in the States, who have extensive experience with, well, 4 now, extensive experience and of talking and teaching about them, observe that if you add a full one of these broad spectrum formulas on top of a full therapeutic dose of a psychiatric medication, the psych med is amplified. Now, that's a good news story for most people because it means that they can use the micronutrients to feel better and take fewer or a lower dose of psychiatric meds. But it's a hard message to get across, and people need to be taught that. And then I always get asked this, what's wrong with just over-the-counter multivitamin mineral formulas? Nothing's wrong with them. There's finally, just last summer, the first ever study showing cognitive function change from one of them, but there's no mental health data yet, and they tend not to be broad enough or sufficient dose. Here are some resources you can look at. Julia's TED Talk has been seen over, TEDx Talk, over 5 million times. Just go to YouTube and Google her name, just search for her name. She has a free course online, a MOOC, massive online open course that has been taken by, I've forgotten how many, 100,000 people so far, I think. And you can go to my website to find a lot of other things. So I will close and the formal part. I like this quote. I think it's something to think about in our modern age. And I'd be happy to answer lots and lots of questions.
Thank you so much, Connie. That was such an informative talk. I know I learned a lot, and it looks like the audience did too. Quickly before you close out of your slides, Nicole was hoping you could go back and show us the half plate image again.
Sure, it's a great image.
Such an excellent visual. I know that she wants it to serve as a reminder, and I think many of us do.
Oh, just go to the food guide um, for Canada. This is now the Canadian food guide norm. It's much better than, I never liked that rainbow thing that Nicole,
Yeah.
that they had. Yeah.
I thought you created this, so I was going to give you all the credit.
No. Oh no, don't give me any credit. No, remember, I'm not, I should put in my disclaimer slide. I'm not a
No, no, sorry,
nutritionist.
I
I'm
was
not a
just kidding.
dietitian. No,
I was joking.
no, but it's
Um,
colorful, isn't it? Yeah.
Such a helpful image for sure. Well,
Yeah,
thank you so much. Now, we do have a few questions from the audience, if you'd like.
sure.
And for those of you who are still in the audience, you're welcome to pop any questions you have in the chat. You can put them in the Q&A, or if you'd like, you can raise your little virtual hand and we will come to you. The first question is from Colleen. Colleen asks, is there any value in other vitamin brands like Jameson? EMP and DEN are prohibitively expensive, especially for a family.
I always get asked this question, so thank you so much, Colleen. It's a very good question. Um, I'm a scientific snob, and if I'm trying to solve a mental health problem, I know that there is no research on Jameson for changing any mental health problems. And if you go to any over-the-counter multivitamin formula, you might be getting a good multivitamin, but it probably has very few minerals. I can think of only one exception. And we think the minerals are much more important in some ways, for some of the things like explosive rage and all. And I tell a story in the book about a child I call Liam, where I think we kind of proved that, but it'll never be published for various reasons. Um, and well, actually, the main reason, because it worked, it changed him so much in 24 hours. These things are very dynamic. You're not building cells. That the father, who was supposed to be charting, couldn't collect any data. So that's kind of strange to say, but that's the truth. So anyway, I would never tell anybody not to take something they buy over the counter. But I would say you can't expect a change in mental health. It's as simple as that. If you say that these products are prohibitively expensive, my reaction is you ain't seen nothing yet, because they're made in the US. So they're, with our dollar getting so weak relative to the US dollar, I think they might go up. It's scary, but I would say that what you should do, Colleen, is pick one person in the family who has the most urgent need. Call the company, enter the data they ask for you for that person, and try it out for that one person, because this is what happens. I don't know any family who is using a full therapeutic dose, um, for everybody in the family. What happens is that people start taking the formula, they figure out when they need more, they figure out when they can get by on less, they figure out an ideal dose, they maybe add some other things in, and they might not be costing as much as you think in the long run. Although for the first few months, you'll probably be on a full dose.
Thank you. That was such a thoughtful response. And I had a similar question to Colleen because I tend to just buy over the counter stuff. It's easy, it's cheaper, but that's always good, I think, for all of us to know that maybe there are strategies that we can use to help integrate this into our lives, into our diets.
You have to ask yourself, do we get what we pay for? Because
Yeah,
these companies designed their formulas for mental health. They've supported in various ways, but not financially, people evaluating their formulas. And they've tried like heck to keep the price down, and it's very hard to do. Yeah.
absolutely. Our next question comes from Carrie, who asks, is there any data that you know about for women who take BSM and medication while pregnant?
No, in order to do that study, Carrie, it's a great question. In order to do that study, you would have to have a physician prescriber who would be willing to lower the dose of the medication as they increase the micronutrients. And most physicians just aren't ready to do that yet. We call it cross titration. Nobody has nobody stops their meds. By the way, don't anybody walk away from this saying that you should stop your meds. I'm never saying that. But if you do introduce some of the micronutrients, as you increase, if you don't begin to do a cross titration, then you could end up having some negative effects.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let's see. Lots of questions coming in. Another one on the list. This one's from an anonymous participant. Says, where is the best place to purchase the book? Hoping to choose an option that best supports the authors.
Oh, thank you. Well, I always ask people to go to your local bookstore first. Um, Now, some people tell me on any given day they can get it at their local bookstore or they can't. That even, we're supposed to be not buying on Amazon now, so that's a good reason to go to your local bookstore too. And at some point, if it's not an international bestseller yet, and probably won't be at that level, but at some point, if all their bills are paid, then more money will go to our charitable funds.
Absolutely. And I think it's so funny. That's exactly what you and I were talking about before the webinar started too, about how I went to my local bookstore to get it. They didn't have it, but they're ordering it in for me. So there are always great ways to support both the authors and local businesses. In the chat, Stefan has asked, also, let's see, also imagine that taking the more expensive supplement would buffer costs associated with other resources, services that are required for mental health. So I
You
guess
know,
that's more of a
yeah.
statement, but also a
It's
very
an
good point.
important, yeah, thank you, Stephen. That is an important statement. From a societal level, there's no question. I mean, some of the case reports that we've studied and published, who we tracked for like a year and longer, in one case, several years, they haven't been back to see a psychiatrist. They haven't been hospitalized again for mental health problems. That's why I said I should give a talk just on cost savings.
And that's so important to think what costs it might offset, either in the immediate or in the long term. Because we oftentimes, I know I think about it when I'm investing in something, that immediate cost to me, I'm like, well, that's above the budget I have right now. But what if in a few months it starts to offset that? Absolutely. Does anyone have any other questions for Bonnie while we have her? You're welcome to put them in the Q&A. You can raise your hand. Well, I'm letting people have a few more moments to think of questions. I do have one myself. For
Right.
someone who is, I admittedly eat processed things more often than I'm proud of because I get busy and I just grab something on the go, and it usually is not of a whole
An
food
apple.
category.
Is
So
not an
what you
apple?
recommend? Yeah, exactly. It's whatever the university has in the cafeteria, and that's definitely not fruit. Um,
No, no.
but for someone who's busy or someone who's just getting started on this journey, what are some easy and concrete steps that I could take or someone like me could take to start to really improve what I'm eating and how I'm eating?
Yeah. So nobody has asked the question about the trendy diets, and I skipped over that slide because I saw time slipping away. So let me answer you, Sarah, by saying that I think the worst thing we can do for people, especially people who might be feeling bad about themselves, I'm not saying you do, but you know, depressed people do, um, they need to feel good about themselves. So no one should start on a super strict diet like a ketogenic diet, which is becoming all the rage, and I'm sure is very important. But start with something easy. So that's what I would say to you. Be kind to yourself. Say, what am I going to change this week? And I would recommend the number one thing would be to start drinking just water or tea, or and maybe you have some coffee too, but no sugary drinks and no artificial sugars, because we just, you know, there are hints in the literature of that messing up things in the gut microbiome. So maybe that should be your first week. Drink bubbly or one of those, you know, if you've missed the carbonation, that's a good transition thing to use. Tell me, what are you willing to share? Uh, what is it? It's not a guilty pleasure, but what what is your failing? What is the thing that you eat that you wish
I
you
Oh, that's such a
could
good
avoid?
question. I usually start the day or the week with the best of intentions of here's my meal plan and here's what I'm gonna make and here's how
A
I'm gonna eat it. And
meal
then
plan. Oh, Sarah, good. Yeah,
I try, I fail.
yeah,
I get stressed and I get busy, and
yeah,
all of a
yeah,
sudden,
yeah.
like 2 days in, my meal plan drops and I'm grabbing something on the way out the door. I'm getting something at the cafeteria, or my partner and I both get home late, and all of a sudden we're like, what are we gonna order because it's too late to cook? And it just, but yeah, no, for me, I think it's stress eating because that's when
Ah,
I tend to snack is when I'm stressed. Chocolate is my vice. And then also, I think just being so busy that I feel like I don't have the time.
okay. I think you need to find some alternative snacks. And maybe one way to do it is to make some granola bars and freeze them, that kind of thing, or little granola bars and little balls of granola or something.
Yeah,
Um, and just have them ready to grab.
that's really
But
smart. So
but
yeah,
I'm
do the
not,
little
yeah,
things.
yeah, I'm not getting from you like, do you drink sodas, for example?
Once in a great while, usually when
Yeah.
I have a headache, like as
So
a
okay, so that's
often
not a
not.
good example for you. So I'm trying to figure out what your weakness is, you know, not
Chocolate,
just
coffee.
chocolate and coffee. But how much chocolate can you, no, don't answer that. Do you eat the natural dark chocolate, or do you eat chocolate bars?
Uh, Usually the not dark stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so you're just eating sugar.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe you can count up the number that you eat in a week and start decreasing it gradually, because if you're addicted, if you have a dependency on sugar as a result of that, don't go cold turkey. Okay.
Okay.
Do that gradually. I'm told, I'm not a nutritionist, but I'm told by enough people that that's how they got off of sugar. Um, that you should
That's great
consider that.
advice.
Yeah. And
Thank
then
you.
you have to have bananas and apples. And in my book, you're going to read about Bonnie's raw veggies. Okay, Sarah shared with me that she just ordered my book, so I know she'll have a copy. There's one chapter of recipes. Don't anybody buy the book for the recipes because there's much more on the internet. But we were required, our publisher, HarperCollins, required that. But the Bonnie raw veggies is my daily snack. And but you have to cut it up on the weekend, a big bowl of raw veggies that will not get soft and soggy. So it's like carrots and snap peas and purple top turnips and radishes and things like that. And if you eat a bowl of those as a snack, you don't have it in your hand. I don't know if that's a problem, but I drizzle a little olive oil on it and a sprinkle of salt, and I just love it. It's my morning snack.
I will definitely give
Take a
that a
look at
try.
that. Yeah.
Thank you. We do have another question from Stefan who says, what are our thoughts on natural, not from concentrate fruit juices, such as orange juice with no sugar added?
You know, uh, it seems stupid to be anti-orange juice, Stefan, so I'm not going to take that position. But for some people, especially those who are overweight and are concerned about diabetes, etc., that is a jolt of sugar. Even though it's natural sugar, it's a jolt of sugar because it's not mixed in with the fiber or anything. You're much better off if you were to get your sugar from an apple, for example, or a banana, but especially anything crunchy. Carrots are very sweet, but they're crunchy, and the fiber helps manage. If you take a look at glycemic index for different fruits and vegetables, then you'll see that that's true. And drinking orange juice is really not the best thing. Um, but it just seems awful to be opposed to drinking orange juice, doesn't it?
To add to that, Faith wants to know what your thoughts are on things like milk and nuts.
Well, if you have lactose intolerance or a nut allergy, then stay away from them. But I'm not sure what you're trying to get at, Faith. Are you just asking about, I mean, nuts, we should be eating nuts every day, probably. I mean, in fact, I think that was in the Globe and Mail article over the weekend by Leslie Beck's column, nutrition column, which is often very educational. Walnuts are very good for your heart. A handful of nuts, almonds is, really excellent. Um, I'm not sure, Faith, do you want to elaborate on that? Why would you ask about milk? Were you looking at that as a snack?
No, I take milk. I don't like tea without like milk. I like milk
Oh,
and then
oh,
I eat nuts a lot.
oh, nuts are great. And milk in your tea, why not? You don't have a lactose intolerance, right?
I do. So I buy the one which is lactose free.
Oh, okay. Well, then you've solved your problem. I don't see anything wrong with it. But I'm not a vegan. A vegan would see something wrong with it, right? Um, yeah, no, I'm an omnivore. Not very much meat, but I do eat anything. I think we're better off in general eating a huge variety of real food, not the ultra processed chemicals, but real food. Thanks for
Absolutely.
asking, Faith.
And thank you, Bonnie. I think that brings us to the end of the questions, unless anyone has anything else. All right, just a friendly reminder for everyone as they're heading out. This is part of the AVA webinar series. It's being recorded. It will be up on our YouTube channel shortly if you'd like to revisit it or any of the other resources in the AVA webinar series. And it will also become a part of our AVA online training platform if you're interested in joining that as well. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Okay.